All right, well, let's begin. Thank you so much for joining me here for the next hour, and good morning and perhaps good afternoon or maybe even good evening to our attendees from all across, from different parts of the world. It is unusual times. Normally we would be doing this presentation live in person, but given the circumstances that we're all in right now, this is the best way to connect with our stakeholders and people who are interested in our research. My name is Dinara Millington, and I'm Vice President of Research of the Canadian Energy Research Institute, and I'm also your host for this webinar today. This is the first webinar that we are hosting, and you can see me. Hopefully you can see me and hear me really well. And I'm happy to say that I am back to the office. I am sitting in my office today as we are slowly opening up and our folks and my colleagues trickling in into back to the offices. So this morning, what I would like to do is spend some time with you sharing some of our preliminary research on our findings of the effectiveness of various carbon options around the world. Don't get confused by the title. The title is a little bit different today. And while we are covering international policies, we're also covering a couple of domestic policies, and hence I went ahead and I changed the title for this morning's webinar. Just before we get going, and a couple of administrative remarks here that I would like to make. My mouse is working. There you go. So if this is the way that you can join us, hopefully you have all received the GoToWebinar link. And some of the options to connect for your audio, if your computer is not working, there's a couple of telephone numbers there with an access code. Also, there will be a question and answer period after my presentation, so feel free to use the question panel among your options through the GoWebinar software. And we will go from there after my presentation. And my presentation should take about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Also, the recording of this webinar, as well as the presentation slides themselves, will be available to all the attendees either on our website or our newly launched CERI YouTube channel. So please, there's many ways to connect. I think most of you are familiar with us. I've taken a look at the attendee list, and I want to say thank you to people who I actually know in person, and to the rest of you, thank you for joining us again. But those of you who are not familiar with us, Canadian Energy Research Institute has been around for the last 45 years. We're a non-for-profit charitable organization, and we specialize in economic analysis and related environmental issues when it comes to Canadian energy development, everything from production, processing, transportation to final end-use consumption. We do produce 8 major studies a year, and the research from this presentation is one of such studies that will be available to you shortly and be published on our website. We also produce quarterly energy commodity updates on topics of crude oil, electricity, and natural gas. And we host our annual petrochemical conference. Unfortunately, this year, we're not going to be able to do it in June, where we normally would host it in Kananaskis, and we have shifted the dates to September, and hoping we'll be able to see many of you there as well. All of our research would not be possible without the generous support of our core funders, which include the Natural Resources Canada, the Department of Energy with Alberta government, and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. We also receive funding support from various organizations that you see there on your screen, as well as in-kind support from a suite of other organizations as well. All right, so let's get into what we'll be talking today, or what I'll be talking today, and you'll be tentatively listening and coming up with really good questions. I will go over the research objectives and the scope for this research. quickly provide an overview of various carbon management policies around the world. And then we will sort of take a deeper dive into evidence-based literature. And then we will go into our modeling methodology and assumptions, and then the evidence that we were able to come up with from our modeling results, and then just conclude with some of the general remarks, and then we will go into Q&A. All right, so why are we doing this study? So there are multiple carbon pricing designs and various policies and regulations around the world that look at addressing the greenhouse gas emissions, which has been evidence to relate to our economic performance and overall economic health and well-being of the society. So the objective for this particular project for us was to take a look at various policies around the world and pick a few case studies that we want to study and evaluate the economic and environmental effectiveness of these policies. So if the goal of the carbon management policies is to reduce emissions while still having some sort of economic growth, we want to understand whether that policy has met its goal. Part of the evaluation was also to look at the policies that have been in existence for many years, where there's enough data available for us to truly measure the impact, and then take some of these lessons learned and potentially apply them to examples that we see here coming out in various provinces and at federal level. All right, so what are we exactly studying? Well, we've taken a look, and the two dominant carbon pricing policies that are currently available and being implemented are some sort of emission trading system, like a cap and trade in California and Quebec, or European Union, or direct carbon pricing policy like a carbon tax. In this particular study, we are studying the European Union emission trading system, the California-Quebec cap and trade regulations, British Columbian carbon tax, and then this hybrid specified gas emissions regulations province of Alberta. It is a more of a hybrid approach, and it's not quite direct as a carbon tax, is not quite as cap and trade. So we are classifying it as its own sort of category of calling it a hybrid approach. The jurisdictions that we're studying are the 25 countries of the European Union. There are a couple of countries that are excluded from our modeling because they have joined European Union after the policy was, the ETS policy was implemented. For the California and Quebec cap and trade, we're studying that against 17 other states in the US. For British Columbia, we're looking at all the provinces, and then for Alberta specified gas emitters, we're looking at sector level modeling. We are applying, and I will get in a little bit more detail about the modeling approach. We are looking at the econometric difference in differences approach, and we're studying specifically three key characteristics: emissions efficiency, emissions reduction, and the real GDP as it represents the economic performance of the economy. All right, so what do we see here? This is the most recent summary map from World Bank, quite recent, that basically outlines the world map and different policies that are either already implemented or scheduled to be implemented. As you can see, the color code legend is on the bottom there for you. There's all across the world, there's various forms of emission trading system, or direct carbon tax, or an approach that looks at a hybrid, where, for example, as you see, the provinces in Canada are outlined with various carbon tax or emission trading system. So it's not one sort of regulation fits all approach. Different countries are looking at their own regional specifications and emission profiles, and trying to address these questions with the policies that ultimately would work for themselves. All right, just getting a little bit into more detail. I'm not going to spend too much time. I will strongly encourage you, once the report is published, that you take a deeper dive and spend a little bit more time understanding these various policies. But we spend quite a bit of time investigating what is out there, what's been implemented, what is scheduled to be implemented, what is the various level of carbon price, and what is the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that particular policy would cover. So as I told you, one of our case studies is to study the emission trading system of the European Union, but it's not to say that within the European Union there are various countries that have, on top of the ETS, they have adopted their own carbon taxes. And as you can see there on your screen, the level of the carbon price varies as low as 8 cents 8 cents per ton of CO2 in Poland, all the way to almost $125 in Sweden. Some of the policies, given that we are studying California, Quebec cap and trade system, we wanted to take a look at various jurisdictions that we actually are studying and what's available out there. And these are some of the examples that are available for the country of United States at the federal and state level. One of the first initiatives where the emissions were to be sort of controlled is the regional greenhouse gas initiative. It's a first mandatory market-based ETS system in the United States to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, it's only looking at the power sector, and it is inclusive of only 10 US states, primarily located in the US eastern coast. There are some other policies that are being looked at and under development or scheduled for implementation, and there you see them on your screen there. Within Canada, again, as you're all aware, we have a Canadian federal carbon tax together with the output-based pricing system. Currently, that carbon price is at $30 per ton of CO2 equivalent. However, again, within the different provinces, there's different versions of carbon tax, output-based pricing system, or emission trading system that have been implemented or looking at to be implemented in the very near future. This is a list of 9 countries that we used as a control group against who we measure European 25 against. And so we've taken a look at what policies those countries have or not have. So as you see, it's a bag of mixed results. A few countries have emission trading systems, some have a carbon tax. Some of them still have those policies being considered and under development. All right, so a little bit, next few slides. Don't worry about too much time spending reading it, but basically what this is we did an intensive research into looking at evidence-based literature. So the difference is, as opposed to, there's plethora of literature out there that talks about the theoretical impact of various carbon management policies. There's a lot of literature out there looking at what could be, having a future outlook of what the policy could accomplish and what kind of emission level it could avoid or potentially even reduce. However, when it came to quantitative type modeling and analysis in trying to evaluate the existing policies and how effective they were, I was quite surprised. There wasn't a lot of literature that we could sort of peruse. But so this next few slides basically showing you the summary of the jurisdictions that we are modeling, and hence we wanted to take a stronger look at what is available out there. And so just a sort of overall summary conclusion, what I found is there's a, in best case, there's a mixed results. Worst case, some of the results are quite opposite of one another. But overall, what I've taken away from that is the emission trading system in the European Union seemed to have had an effect on greenhouse gas emissions. However, the effect of other microeconomic conditions, such as, for example, the financial crisis of 2008, sometimes it's hard to decipher the impacts, whether it's the emissions were reduced as a result of the policy or as a result of the overall downturn and hence the reduction overall in energy demand. But some papers were able to pinpoint the results a little bit stronger, especially those ones that have higher frequency data, and the ones that are concentrating on specific sectors or specific level of prices that they're studying. That's what we found. So this is the snapshot of looking at the European Union ETS. The next slide looks at some of the other countries around the world. This other interesting study, the first one here, is looking at the comparative review of different emission trading systems in Europe, United States, California, and Quebec. And one of the results that the authors, the researchers have walked away with in this particular paper is that they're suggesting California and Quebec ETS has the best overall performance. And this last one is looking at the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the United States that have seemed to have worked and have been able to, the author's been able to show that there was a emission reduction as a result of the policy. There's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of literature on studying the carbon tax in British Columbia, and with various results and various quantitative methods on evaluating the carbon tax. However, we were not able to find anything on the Alberta specified gas emitters regulation. So to all my friends out there, please, if you have come across evidence-based literature, please share it with me, send it my way. We'll be most grateful to include some of that literature in our final report. All right. So again, the primary purpose of this report was to evaluate whether the implementation of each carbon management policy, such as emission trading system or carbon tax or a hybrid approach, does reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the most intuitive way to go about it is to compare greenhouse gas emissions of different regions before and after the implementation of such policy. However, it is required not only to look at the difference before and after the policy implementation, it is also important to determine the changes that were caused specifically as a result of a specific policy. And so recently, and in recent times and recent years, researchers have been using this what they call the difference in differences approach, or DID, which originated back in 1980s, but recently been brought back by one of the papers in 2004. It is a widely used mechanism to evaluate policy effectiveness, and the advantage of this approach is in evaluating policies, but avoiding the endogenous problems caused by using policies themselves as explanatory variables. So basically what this approach does, it controls better for systemic differences between the treatment group, which is where the jurisdictions that have been affected by a policy implementation, against the control group, those jurisdictions that have not been affected by the policy. And so in this particular report, we adopt this approach to capture the effect of the policies on the economic and environmental performance in the studied jurisdictions. Okay, but this is just a visual representation of what visually what the model does. So basically, for a simple difference in difference technique, we let the YT and YC at time 1 denote the average outcome variable at treated and control groups after the policy intervention or implementation. Similarly, the YT and YC at time 0 denotes the average outcome variable at treated and control groups before the policy implementation. And so what this technique does, it estimates the average impact, as you see there on your screen. Again, the lines, the top line that shows you that treatment effect measure, the top line does not necessarily have to go higher than the line before the policy implementation. It can actually go below. This is just a visual, again, visual representation of what we're trying to measure here. So then what we did is we replaced that Y outcome, the Y variable that you saw on the previous screen, and we replaced it with what we call emissions efficiency index. And it is measured by us collecting the data on GDP at various country and jurisdiction levels and greenhouse gas emissions, and taking the ratio for each time period and for each country. So then using this definition of the outcome variable as an emission efficiency variable, we calculate the average impact of a carbon management policy, as you see there on your screen, as a difference not only within time periods before and after policy implementation, but also within the control and treatment group, because they're each modeled separately. All right, so just not to bore you with too many questions, I promise you this is the last slide on that. But just to give you a little bit more detail for those of you who are really interested, this is our econometric approach, our model specification. In this particular case, the fixed effective region is added to the model to avoid the pseudo correlation between policy issuance and implementation effect caused by regional differences. And so in the equation that you see here, the YJT variable is the emission efficiency index that I just showed you for country J at a time T. And the key variable of interest to us is that beta 1 coefficient. It is our deed estimator. And it would sort of show you the effectiveness of the policy by estimating the difference between the difference in emissions efficiency between the control group and the treatment group. The coefficient of the interaction, this beta 1, indicates whether the implementation of the carbon management policy had a significant impact on the emissions efficiency. And so the treatment variable is a dummy variable basically for a treatment group. And then the post policy is a time dummy for the policy implementation. Within the model, within each case study and each model, there's another set of control variables that you see there on your screen. These are the location-specific characteristics of the of various jurisdictions to control for any observable differences that might impact our analysis. And basically what the result what we're looking for is the value and statistical significance of this beta 1 coefficient. Basically saying that if beta 1 is positive and higher than 0, that means the output per unit of CO2 equivalent emissions is increasing, which means it increases the emissions efficiency, which in turn would indicate that it's increasing the environmental performance of that specific jurisdiction that's being measured. Some other assumptions that we had to implement is for the DID approach to work well, the treatment and control group must behave somewhat similarly prior to policy intervention, and I'm going to show you that through the visual inspection. And then we ran a series of placebo tests to make sure that our results are not spurious and to make sure that the year of the policy implementation did have an effect, and the policy itself had an effect on the treated jurisdictions. All right, very quickly, again, these are the 4 case studies that we're looking at. The European Union emission trading system, the California Quebec cap and trade, the carbon tax in the province of British Columbia, and the specified gas emitters regulation in the province of Alberta. This is the set of parameters. As I already mentioned, emission efficiency is measured as a ratio of real GDP per greenhouse gas emissions as measured in kilotons. The total greenhouse gas emissions are not inclusive of the land use related emissions. The set of other control variables include fossil fuel dependency, industrialization, capital intensity, energy price. I will not here today, I will not be presenting the results or the coefficients on the list of the control variables, just because we don't only have limited time. But again, I strongly encourage you to sort of, look at the report once it's available to sort of understand and have a more detailed breakdown of the equations and their results. So again, this is that visual inspection that I was telling you about. As you can see, for the case of the European Union emission trading system that was implemented in the year 2005, our treatment group is the list of European Union 25 countries minus, I think there's 4 or 5 countries that we had to exclude because they became part of EU after 2005. And then the control group is a list of the 9 countries that I showed you at the beginning. So visually, as you can see, more or less, they are moving in the same trajectory before the policy intervention. Same thing for California and Quebec cap and trade system. Our treatment group is the state of California and the province of Quebec against the control group, which is a list of 17 US states. Same thing in case of British Columbia. As you can see, the treatment group is a province of BC against the 10 provinces in Canada. Prior to carbon tax implementation in 2008, the 2 lines move somewhat parallel to one another. And this is the Alberta specified gas emitters. Again, the treatment group are the various sectors in Alberta, as you saw on the slide, against the same sectors in different provinces in Canada. SGR was implemented in 2007. However, it's one of the only cases in all of our cases studied where that policy is no longer enforced. But we still wanted to study the effectiveness on what it ultimately did or did not do. All right, so jumping into the results. So basically what we're interested in is that coefficient beta 1, which you see there in your row that is titled as did. And then the columns represent the 4 different cases. So for the emission trading system, we evaluate European Union and California cap and trade. And as you can see, the coefficient, the beta 1 coefficient is statistically significant and positive for European Union and California and Quebec, indicating that since the policy implementation in those jurisdictions, emission efficiency has increased, which means the output, so the GDP, the unit of output has increased per unit of greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to carbon tax in British Columbia, that coefficient is negative and not statistically significant, and the same with the case of Alberta specified gas emitters. So I'll jump into a little bit more results further down. So this is just the effect on the emission efficiency. We then did same modeling exercise specifically on the environmental and economic performance. So this result is showing the effect on real GDP. So again, what this means is that the European emission trading system seemed to have had a negative impact on the GDP in the European Union countries, a positive and statistically significant impact in California and Quebec, and again, positive impact in both cases of BC and Alberta with statistical significance. Well, however, when it comes to emissions, there's a mixed results that we see here. The emissions did decrease in the European Union, as you see there, with a statistically significant negative coefficient. Same with California and Quebec. However, when it came to BC and Alberta case, we're not seeing a statistically significant impact of the carbon tax policy in British Columbia on their overall emissions. However, with Alberta case, we are seeing a statistically significant result, but we're not seeing the right sign. So the coefficient there is positive, indicating that emissions actually increased as a result of the policy in Alberta. The oil price there, I just wanted to include one of the control variables that was part of the modeling was the oil price, and as you can see, specifically for British Columbian case, how significant that variable is for the impact on the emissions in that province, which is not surprising given that majority of greenhouse gas emissions in that province come from the transportation sector, and so it's closely impacted by the overall oil prices and refined petroleum prices. So the placebo effect, basically what that indicates is if we were to take a fake treatment year, so for European Union, we used 2004, basically what the result shows is a non-significant coefficient, basically means that the treatment year, the fake treatment year was not significant in our modeling, which means the model that we have previously used is not spurious and it is robust. And so for all the 4 cases that were looked at, all the 4 models have passed the placebo test. Again, so this is just a summary of the last 3 slides that you saw. Just wanted to show you this as a summary slide. So, the question is, did the policy have an effect on emission efficiency, GDP, and emissions? So for emission efficiency, there is a significant impact, significant and positive impact in European Union and California and Quebec cap and trade. There's no statistical significance in the cases of BC and Alberta. There is overall impact in GDP in all 4 jurisdictions, in all 4, but the European Union GDP actually had a positive impact as a result of the policy. But the European Union, we really have to look at the coefficients. I don't know if you noticed, but the coefficient on GDP was the negative impact on GDP is less in magnitude than it is an overall emission reduction. So while the policy did have a negative impact on the economic growth in European Union, the emissions have decreased at a higher rate than the GDP. And so again, the overall impact on emissions from the 4 policies showed statistical significance in our results, where for European Union and California and Quebec, the emissions have actually decreased as a result of the policy. In the case of Alberta, the emissions actually increased. And so just to wrap it up, so we have lots of time for Q&A. What we found is, based on the 4 cases that we have studied, that emission trading system was more effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So if that's the policy goal, is to reduce emissions, it seems that emission trading system is more effective at doing that than carbon tax or hybrid policy. As I already mentioned, the evidence suggests while GDP was negatively impacted in the European Union, the magnitude of the effect is smaller than the overall effect on the emission levels in those countries. With the California-Quebec cap and trade, the analysis does suggest that the system is effective at reducing emissions, and hence we saw an increasing emissions efficiency without negatively impacting the economic growth. And some of these findings are in line with some of the other literature that we're able to find for these specific cases. When it comes to BC and Alberta, the results are sort of somewhat mixed. Our modeling has showed that while BC carbon tax did boost economic activity, so the overall GDP growth, it had no effect on the emissions. So when you look at the overall emissions in British Columbia since the policy was implemented in 2008, there was a time when emissions were the emissions, if you look at the data, we can see that the emissions are not, they're stable, they're not growing, but they're not actually decreasing. So partly, part of this is the sort of the result of our modeling, and also the feedback mechanism that if BC were to take the revenues of carbon tax and were reinvesting them, that would mean an increase in economic activity, which might not necessarily result in a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And so what the policy might have done is it avoided future emissions without actually reducing the overall emissions. With the Alberta specified gas emitters policy, it failed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, that was one of the policy goals, I believe, when the policy was in force. It actually had an opposite effect. It increased the greenhouse gas emissions. And what we found, there's a strong correlation between GDP and greenhouse gas emissions, indicating an increase in economic activity would generally increase emissions with that. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. So I am right on time. So I would love to see your questions. And just before I wrap it up, I just want to do a little plug-in. Our next webinar will be hosted on June 9th, and that one would look at various methodologies and in evaluating the unit of electricity costs. So that will be exciting. And then again, the new dates for our petrochemicals conference are September 23rd through September 25th, again in the Pomeroy, Kananaskis. All right, so let's get to questions. Just give me a second here. All right, so let's just start from the top. I'm not sure. Oh, there's a timestamp right there. Okay, so one question was, did this study take natural gas and oil prices into consideration? One of the control variables that we are using are Brent prices, not WTI or Western Canadian Select prices. With the case of the Alberta specified gas emitters, we are looking at the sectoral level. So each emitting sector that would be impacted by the specified gas emitters. So indirectly, the economic activity of those sectors indirectly would imply that there is some understanding and some room for natural gas and oil prices that are domestic to this specific market. But we're not directly including Western Canadian Select or WTI. Some important piece of research, have some suggestions. Excellent, yes, I'm happy to hear suggestions, Corinne. Yes, the deck will be available. I believe the deck will be shared, the slide deck will be shared right on our website right when I finish. So I'll let Capri know to put it on there. Emissions did not decrease as an absolute term. Oh, 1 second, the questions are moving way too fast. Emissions did not decrease is an absolute term. How does emissions trend compare on emission intensity basis? So the emissions, the emissions efficiency index, the ratio of GDP per unit of greenhouse gas emissions per kiloton of emissions was one way for us to study the performance, the environmental and economic performance. However, emission intensity, if we were to look at the opposite ratio, sort of the tons of CO2 per unit of output, that's a good question. That's a relevant question, but no, we did not specifically study the emission intensity basis. We looked at the emissions efficiency because the premise, the whole objective of the study was to understand whether the policy were effective at reducing emissions or not, overall emissions. The cap and trade did impact the growth in the EU negatively, unlike the California and BC. Any reasons why? When we did the European Union case, yes, we did see a negative impact on the GDP economic growth. And one way, when you look at the full equation, which I did not present in this presentation, the capital formation in industrialization variable were also statistically significant variables. So what we're assuming is one of the reasons is we saw a little bit of a carbon leakage happening in the European Union, where some of the industries were shrinking in size and potentially leaving to other jurisdictions that were not controlled by the emission trading system. Is India and China typically included in such analysis? So we did find a study. So the reason we went with the case studies we went with is because we needed enough historical data for us to be able to have any meaningful statistical model. With China's case, because they're looking at piloting carbon tax in their country, I think it's the pilots have started either this year or last year. There's just not enough history for us to measure. And so, you know, if there's enough information and enough history where the policy have been implemented in China, we could potentially collect information and study it. But this specific analysis did not include India and China. All right, let's see. Okay, bear with me. All right, question. There are a lot of different greenhouse gas mitigation policies happening at the same time. Does a model account for this? For example, lower emissions can be a result of efficiency standards regulations. Can you separate those from emissions pricing? Great question, and hello, Carlos, to you too. Yes, so if you saw in the slides that I show the results, there is there's a line that says other policies or other regulations. Basically what that is, it controls for other policies that might take away some of the impact from the carbon emissions, carbon management policy. So for example, in the case of, which was it? I think it was the California and Quebec case where we had to control for other policies so the other policies are inclusive in the modeling. In the European case, I believe we had to control for carbon tax in the countries within the European Union. I think that's, yeah, so there are other policies. So for example, within Canada, policies like the coal retirement policy would have indirectly impact emissions, but not directly price them. So we had to control for that. So yes, we are probably not inclusive of all policies that might have an impact, but the major ones are definitely included. Oh, am I missing questions? 1 second. Let me just do it this way. Oh. Any preliminary thoughts on the effectiveness of 45Q policy in the United States? Not yet. We are thinking of including some of the sort of potential theoretical impacts of the future policies that are, or the policies that have been implemented recently, but not in this presentation. So maybe for the final report, we will include some thoughts around that. Thank you. All right. Are there any more questions? I've gone through my list. Maybe give maybe another 30 seconds or a minute or so. In the meantime, I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe as we, as we swim through these unusual times for all of us. I'm sure happy that it's getting super nice outside, and I finally can spend a little bit more time enjoying the outdoors. Well, I think I'll leave it here. I'm gonna give you back your 10 minutes. I think I finished a little bit earlier. So with that, thank you very, very much for your time, and I want to give a big shout out to our researchers that have spent many hours doing this study with me. And I know you guys are on call, so thank you very much. Special thank you to you and all the attendees. And as well, and what I forgot to do at the beginning is to thank our flagship sponsor for all of our webinars. Thank you, Floor Canada, for providing the sponsorship dollars to fund these events. And with that, thank you very much, and we will see you again. Take care.